Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive deep into NORAD and Canada's nuclear dilemma during the Cold War.
Yeah.
We're going to look at this really interesting period when Canada had to, kind of figure out its place in the world,
Right.
how it fit in with the U.S. and this whole, looming threat of nuclear war, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So our source material is a podcast episode
Yeah.
from Mr. Hutchings History.
Yeah.
And it's made for these advanced history students.
Yeah, it's a period full of tough choices, right? All this international stuff going on in the sense that, things could go really bad really quickly
Things could, yeah.
as the whole world tried to deal with the Cold War.
Yeah, so let's rewind back to the late 1950s, right? The Cold War is at its peak. The Soviets are a major threat, and North America's feeling pretty vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to this huge decision, right?
Yeah.
The formation of NORAD in 1957.
Right, NORAD, that's the North American Aerospace Defense Command.
Right.
A big agreement between Canada and the U.S. to protect the airspace over both countries. And for Canada, this was a big change.
Yeah.
Before this, they were kind of more isolationist, but this potential nuclear conflict meant they had to work together.
So it's NORAD really showed Canada was serious about defending the continent, right? Standing side by side with the U.S.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
They set up this joint command with the Royal Canadian Air Force and the U.S. Air Force all working together at NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs.
Wow.
Yeah, that shows you how close the partnership was.
It's interesting to think how that, changed how other countries saw Canada.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it showed that Canada was a big player in Western defense, right?
Yeah.
A reliable ally protecting North America. But it also started this debate about whether Canada was relying too much on the U.S.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Maybe losing some of its independence on defense.
And speaking of independence, Canada was working on its own super advanced fighter jet at the time, right? The Avro Arrow.
Yeah, the Avro Arrow. Huge source of pride for Canadians.
Oh, yeah.
This supersonic jet fighter, it was a symbol of Canada's technology and its ambition to be a leader in aerospace.
But then in 1959, Prime Minister Diefenbaker makes this, really controversial decision to cancel the program.
Yeah, the cancellation was a shock to the whole country.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about losing this amazing piece of technology. It also made people ask, could Canada really make its own choices in a world where superpowers were calling the shots?
Yeah, so many jobs lost. People saw it as a hit to Canada's independence.
Yeah, and the Avro Arrow cancellation, it wasn't just about money and military stuff,
Oh.
It was symbolic of this bigger debate about Canadian sovereignty and how its relationship with the U.S. was changing.
Yeah.
This debate would just get bigger as Canada had to figure out its role in nuclear defense.
And that brings us to, the next part of the story, right? The BOMARC missile debate.
Yeah.
So to replace the Avro Arrow, Canada agreed to take the BOMARC missile system from the U.S. These long-range supersonic missiles designed to, stop Soviet bombers.
Yeah, the BOMARC deployment, well, it made Canada's role in the Cold War even more complicated. On the surface, it seemed like a logical move to, make North America safer.
Sure.
But these missiles were meant to carry nuclear warheads.
So?
And that caused a huge controversy all over Canada.
So now Canada, a country known for peacekeeping and diplomacy, is right in the middle of this nuclear arms race.
It was a really tough spot for Canada,
Yeah.
The threat from the Soviets was real, but accepting nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, that seemed to go against everything the country stood for, their opposition to spreading nuclear weapons. This dilemma, it would dominate Canadian politics and what people were talking about for years.
I bet.
Yeah.
This idea of having nuclear weapons right here in Canada, it really sparked a huge debate.
Well, yeah.
Canadians were split right down the middle.
You had some Canadians who saw the BOMARC missiles as a necessary evil,
Right.
They said, look, if the Soviets might attack with nukes, we need these weapons to stop them from doing it, But others were like, no way, that goes against everything Canada stands for, We're a peaceful nation.
Absolutely. Protests all across the country.
Yeah.
Petitions going around, people sending tons of letters to the government saying, hey, you got to rethink this.
Yeah, this was a real test for Canada, sticking to their values.
Right. And even within the government, there was a lot of disagreement.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Howard Green, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was a big critic of it.
What did he say?
He argued that, if Canada accepts these nuclear warheads, it'll hurt their reputation in the world.
I see.
Especially, since Canada was trying to get rid of nuclear weapons altogether.
Yeah. It must have been tough for Prime Minister Diefenbaker, right? Trying to keep everyone happy, the U.S. and Canadians who didn't want nukes.
He was in a tough spot, pressure from the U.S. to, follow through on the NORAD agreement, and then all this pushback at home.
Yeah. Diefenbaker, well, he kind of tried to play both sides.
Oh, really?
First, he agreed to get the BOMARC missiles.
Okay.
But then he dragged his feet when it came to actually putting the nuclear warheads on them.
That's interesting.
All this back and forth, it just made everyone even more anxious,
Oh, yeah, I bet.
It seemed like Canada wasn't sure what it wanted in the Cold War,
Right.
and how it fit in with the U.S. and this uncertainty. It also showed up in another big thing they did, building the Diefenbunker.
A Diefenbunker?
Yeah, this massive underground bunker near Ottawa.
What was it for?
It was meant to protect government officials if, a nuclear attack happened.
Wow.
I mean, just the fact that they built the Diefenbunker shows you how scared people were back then.
Yeah.
The threat of nuclear war, it wasn't just some idea. It was like a very real possibility.
Right.
And it really affected how governments and people thought about the world.
Imagine how everyday Canadians felt. Seeing this huge bunker being built, like a constant reminder that things could go nuclear.
The Diefenbunker, it became a symbol of all that Cold War fear.
But I bet it was controversial too, right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Some people said, look, it's just being prepared, in case the worst happens.
Right.
But others thought it was like way too much, a sign that Canada was getting caught up in all this fear-mongering.
Yeah, maybe even being pushed around by the U.S.
Right. So with all this going on, how do historians make sense of Canada's actions back then?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, there are a few different schools of thought. Some historians, the post-revisionists, they say that Diefenbaker hesitating on the nuclear warheads was him trying to show Canada could make its own decisions.
So he wasn't just doing whatever the U.S. wanted.
Exactly. Trying to keep the U.S. happy, but also, doing what was best for Canada.
Makes sense.
Then you have the liberal internationalist view.
Okay.
They focus on Canada's role as like a middleman during the Cold War. They say that Canada was on the side of the West, but also trying to do things its own way.
Okay.
Like working together with other countries and finding peaceful solutions.
So it's like a balancing act for
Oh, wow.
Canada. Being a good ally, but also staying true to its own values.
Right. Then there's the realist perspective. They look at the hard facts of the situation. They argue that Canada, stuck between two superpowers, didn't have a lot of choices.
Right.
And teaming up with the U.S. for protection just made the most sense.
Yeah, like realpolitik in action.
Exactly. And finally, there are the critical historians. They're more skeptical.
Okay.
They say Canada got too close to the U.S. military,
Yeah.
and maybe gave up some of its independence and commitment to peace, all to keep the alliance strong.
It's amazing how these different views show us just how complex Canada's experience in the Cold War really was.
Yeah, each perspective gives us a different way of looking at what happened back then.
And it reminds us that dealing with other countries, especially when things are tense globally, well, it's really complicated.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it seems like every decision back then had these, ripple effects.
Yeah.
Changing Canada's relationship with the U.S., its image in the world, even how Canadians saw themselves.
Right, and the legacy of NORAD and all that debate about nuclear weapons, it still affects Canadian defense policy today.
Oh, yeah.
It raises questions that are still important in the 21st century,
Like what?
Like, how does a country like Canada balance being part of these big alliances, but also having its own goals in the world?
And how do you decide, when it's more important to work with others on defense
Right.
versus maybe getting pulled into conflicts you don't want to be in?
Tough questions. No easy answers. The Cold War might be over, but trying to figure out all this global stuff, these potential threats, that's not gone away.
It's interesting looking back, how much public opinion mattered back then.
Yeah.
Canadians were really involved in this whole nuclear weapons thing, challenging their leaders, making them think about the ethics of it all.
Oh, right. It shows you how important it is for people to be informed,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to war and peace.
totally.
Governments make these big decisions, but they affect everyone, so people need to speak up.
So to sum up our deep dive into NORAD and Canada's, nuclear dilemma, we've looked at this period of uncertainty, tough decisions, trying to find a balance on the world stage.
We saw how Canada dealt with being in the Cold War alliance, the controversies with the Avro Arrow and the BOMARC missiles, all that anxiety that led to building the Diefenbunker.
And we looked at, how historians interpret all this stuff,
Right.
realizing there's no one right answer to how Canada got through this complicated time.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. History's not always simple and straightforward.
Right.
It's messy, there are different perspectives, and questions that stick with us long after things have happened.
We hope this deep dive helped you understand this important part of Canadian history, a part that still affects Canada's place in the world.
As you think about what we've talked about, consider this. Knowing what we know now about the Cold War, the threat of nuclear weapons spreading, and how tricky these international alliances can be, how should Canada handle all this in the 21st century?
It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this journey through history. Until next time, keep exploring.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.